Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD Capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Hello and welcome to the Tough Decisions podcast. This is your Sunday edition with Dennae, and we are going to finish up our discussion of the public speaking secrets of the world's top minds. We're talking through a book called Talk Like TED, written by Carmine Gallo, the 9 public speaking secrets of the world's top minds, and we've covered 7 of those, and we've talked briefly about making our presentations memorable. We've talked about making them novel. We've talked about appealing to emotion. And so today we're going to finish up with making them memorable. And I'm going to cover secrets 8 and 9 today together, just because I feel like they don't warrant a separate episode each. And they're fairly simple concepts, really very important, of course, but they don't require a lot of discussion or explanation. So we're just going to cover those here briefly today, and then next week we'll get into another book that I'll let you know about towards the end of today's podcast. Now, last week, if you recall, we talked about the 18-minute rule and the rule of 3, and Gallo talked about how he believed the Goldilocks time for a presentation was somewhere between 18 and 20 minutes. Of course, there are times when the information to be presented requires a little bit longer time. And so we also discussed how you can provide mental breaks for your audience within a longer time frame. For example, if you're speaking for an hour and a half, then every 18 to 20 minutes or so, you should provide some sort of mental break, either with a video clip or a demonstration or a picture, or perhaps hearing from someone different for a brief time. Those are all ways to give your audience a mental break. Today, we're going to talk about the public speaking secret number 8, which is to create a mental picture with multi-sensory experiences. So paint a mental picture with multi-sensory experiences. And as we have discussed with each of these public speaking secrets, there is a reason, there's a scientific reason why this works. So let me share just a little bit of the scientific data behind this, because I do think it's very important that we understand the reasons why we prepare a presentation this way. Otherwise, if we don't understand it, then when we get into a time crunch or we get, rushed, then we may tend to just, that's not really that important. It is important. It's very important. And when you understand why, then we will be more willing to put in the work and the time that's required to create this type of presentation. So Richard Mayer, a professor of psychology at UC Santa Barbara, he has done a lot of research regarding multimedia learning. And he suggests that it's far more effective, not just a little bit, but far more effective to explain concepts when we use multiple methods of sensory input. So think with me about the last presentation that you saw or you listened to, and think about how many different types of sensory inputs the speaker use. Typically, they're going to use the auditory input, right? That's the speaking. But did they use a visual input? Did they use any kinesthetic input? Kinesthetic, if you're unfamiliar with the term, that just means touch or feel. Movement can be included in that. So was it just auditory, or was there some visual input as well? Was there kinesthetic input? I think that is particularly important when it can be incorporated, because so many of us learn by moving and by doing, or by actually experiencing what is being discussed. So in the college setting as he was, you can imagine that Dr. Mayer has done a lot of research with his own students and with the students there at the school. And what he found was that whenever there was a combination of sensory input, so there was auditory and visual, or auditory and kinesthetic, there was text and pictures, or animation and video and text, animation and auditory input. Whenever there was a combination, it always, not just sometimes, but it always led to better recall. And there's a lot of theories out there about why this is, how this actually happens in the brain, and why the brain responds so much better to multisensory inputs. But essentially what they've come up with is that when the brain gets the information in more than one way, then it is able to process the information multiple times and store it in multiple locations in the brain. And I'm not, a neuroscientist by any stretch of the imagination. I know a little bit about how the brain works and learning just because of my experience in teaching, but essentially the brain is able to store it in different ways and in multiple locations. And then it just makes sense from there that if we have it in multiple locations and we've processed it in multiple ways, then it's going to be much easier to recall. This is particularly important when we have no prior experience or prior knowledge of the information. So, especially if you're speaking on a topic that is relatively unknown, or perhaps you're presenting some new research for the very first time, or maybe in the business world, you're presenting a new product or a new idea, a new business idea. All of those things where there would be no prior experience or no prior information as a leaping off point, at that point, these multisensory inputs become even more important than normal. Now, I do want to stop and talk just a minute about something that Gallo emphasizes in this chapter, which is something he calls death by PowerPoint. Maybe you've heard of that before. I know that's something I've been familiar with, or I've heard the term thrown around, death by PowerPoint. He is not advocating not using PowerPoint at all, but Gallo is advocating the idea that we drastically change the way most people use PowerPoint. Now, I think that you will agree with me when I say that typically we use PowerPoint, or we see PowerPoint used as a way of summarizing the speaker's main points. And I think there's several reasons for that. Number one, it's the easiest thing to do, right? It's just easy to put and summarize in bullet points your main points on a PowerPoint, and you throw it up there, and we feel good about the fact that we have a multi-sensory input, because after all, the words are printed on the screen and people can read the words, and we're also saying it. So there you go, there's my multi-sensory input. Well, that's not really how it works. It does help somewhat, I think, to have the words printed on the screen, but that brings us to another point that he makes, which is, and we've talked about this before on other podcasts, which we are really, really bad at multitasking. So if you throw a bunch of words up on a PowerPoint screen behind you while you're talking, people are either reading the PowerPoint or they're listening to you. They're not doing both. And that's just science, okay? So lots and lots of research has been done to show that we don't multitask very well at all. Now, he does mention one scientist who discusses the fact that we can multitask to a certain degree. I mean, most of us can walk and talk at the same time, or walk and concentrate and carry on a conversation at the same time. But that's not really multitasking for the brain, because it's not two things that require our attention. And that's what we mean when we say multitasking. So the point of all that is to say, when you throw up words on a PowerPoint screen behind you, you're not really getting the multisensory input that we sometimes think we are, because your audience is either reading the screen or they're listening to you, but they're not doing both. I've experienced this myself in teaching, because I've used PowerPoints before in teaching, and if you make a mistake and you put something on the PowerPoint before you're ready, I've done that, for example, when I taught literature, or grammar, I would, put pictures or put example sentences or paragraphs on a screen. If you put that up there before you're ready and you make a mistake, immediately the student's attention goes to that PowerPoint screen, and then they're not listening to anything that you've said after that point. So Gallo is basically saying, let's get rid of PowerPoint the way we normally would use it, or traditional PowerPoint, and let's change the way we use it. Now, one other thing, he said that the average PowerPoint slide has about 40 words. 40 words. That's a lot of words on a PowerPoint slide. Gallo says that in the TED presentations that he's used, it's not anywhere near that average. And he gives a couple of examples. One speaker that we've mentioned before in this book discussion, Brené Brown, it took her 25 slides to get to 40 words. So she wasn't even close to that average. And Gallo is basically saying that that's how we should use PowerPoint. We should use PowerPoint with pictures, images, illustrations, video clips in order to support what we're saying, but not as to take the place of what we're saying. The other reason I think that we sometimes use PowerPoint that way with all the text and bullet points is just a matter of laziness on the speaker's part. Well, I didn't have quite as long to practice and prepare as I wanted to, so if I put my main points up on the PowerPoint, then I'll be able to remember where I need to go and what I need to say. That's just a matter of lack of preparation. And so if we solve that problem, then we can make better use of PowerPoint and use it as a multisensory input, which is the way it needs to be. Another concept that Gallo discusses is something called the picture superiority effect. And I mentioned this briefly earlier, but essentially to the human brain, a picture is far superior to words. And again, it has to do with the way we process that picture. If we just say a word or we just hear a word, our brain processes it one time. If we see a picture and are asked to remember a word, our brain processes it 2 different times in 2 different locations, and so therefore it's much, much easier to recall. He talks about if you hear information, you're likely to remember about 10% of the information 3 days later. And of course, that's based on research and experiments that they've set up. So 3 days later, you can remember approximately 10% of what you hear. If you add a picture, you are likely to remember more like 65% of that information. So let's put that into context. If you give a presentation and use only words, 3 days later, your audience is going to remember approximately 10% of what you told them. If you add pictures and images, they're likely to remember more like 65%. That's 6 times the information that they can remember just by adding some images or some visuals. And this is known as the picture superiority effect. The way our brain processes the information and the way it stores is drastically changed whenever we add an image or a visual. So in conclusion on this topic of PowerPoint, the TED commandment that Carmine Gallo kind of summarizes with is we need to use visuals to enhance words, not duplicate them. Use visuals to enhance our words, not duplicate them. Now, another interesting concept that I think that we should touch on is the idea that the brain is not actually able to tell the difference between what it actually sees and what it imagines. So a PowerPoint picture is very effective. A visual, an image on a PowerPoint is very effective. But if we can create the same imagery inside the brain, then we have just the same effect. So well-chosen words and well put together imagery can actually create the same effect for us. And the brain doesn't know the difference between the mental picture and the actual picture. If we can get our audience to effectively imagine the feelings and the information and the setting that we want, then that can also be very effective. Another way of adding this multisensory input is through simple props. It doesn't have to be PowerPoint. It doesn't have to be something that they see on a screen. It can be a simple prop. And Gallo gives some examples of some very effective TED speakers who just brought props with them and laid them on a simple table in front of the audience and use them at the appropriate times in their presentation and use them very effectively. So, public speaking secret number 8 of the world's top minds is paint a mental picture with multi-sensory experiences. When you're presenting to an audience, especially if you're presenting unfamiliar information, you should try to include as many of their senses as possible. Again, the easiest ones are auditory and visual, but sometimes it's also possible to include some kinesthetic experiences and go from there. But as many as you can include, you want to, because that will definitely assist in helping the audience recall and process the information the way you want them to. Now, finally, secret number 9 is very simple. The title of the chapter Gallo gives us is Stay in Your Lane. And essentially what he's saying is that you cannot copy or mimic or be any of these other TED speakers the way they were. So don't worry about trying to be Sir Richard Branson or Bill Gates or Ken Robinson or Tony Robbins. You don't have to be any of the speakers that have spoken before. You just have to be yourself and use these techniques effectively. You know, people can spot a phony pretty easily. And if you're not yourself, you're not going to be comfortable, and that's going to be obvious. So, number 9, stay in your lane. Be authentic, be open, be transparent, allow people to see the real you, and then you will be able to communicate with them. If they don't sense that they're getting the real person, if they sense that you have put up this facade, or you've put up this wall because now you're speaking in front of them, then there's going to be a disconnect. There's going to be a difficulty in connecting with them. And that's going to dramatically hinder your ability to communicate with them. You know, I want to read just a brief part of one of the paragraphs that Gallo includes. He says, keep this in mind. When you deliver a presentation, your goal should not be to deliver a presentation. It should be to inspire your audience, to move them, and to encourage them to dream bigger. You cannot move people if they don't think you're real. You'll never convince your audience of anything if they don't trust, admire, and genuinely like you. And how can they trust you? How can they admire you? How can they genuinely like you if they don't feel like they're seeing the real you? So this is very, very important. We have to get to the place where we can communicate with people and they sense that we are being real with them, that they see the real person. And that requires some vulnerability, that requires some honesty, and just being able to sit and have a conversation. Remember, that was one of the first public speaking secrets that we discussed, was being able to have a conversation and make your presentation like a conversation so that people are disarmed and they understand that what they're getting is the actual real person. Just to close here, let me share the quote that he opens this chapter with. It's a quote from Richard Branson, but I think this is a good one to end on because it will help us realize that there really can't be a work or play. It has to be all of us. Branson says, I don't think of work as work and play as play. It's all living. Everything. Work is work, play is play. You can't separate those two things. Everything is living, and we have to live with people, in front of people, and allow them to see and feel that they are getting the real us. Otherwise, our communication is just not going to be what it needs to be and what we want it to be, because they don't feel like they're hearing from the real person. So using multi-sensory experiences and staying in our lane, that concludes our discussion of the public speaking secrets of the world's top minds. I hope you've learned a lot from this book review and book study. I know I have learned a lot, and the next time I speak in public, I know I'm going to approach things a little bit differently, and that's really what we want. We want the tools, and we want the knowledge to know how to use the tools, and then an opportunity to practice the tools. So next week, we're going to jump into a book called Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depends on It. And I've already started reading, and this is another great book. If you've listened to our podcast at all over the last year, you know that several of the people that we've interviewed have recommend, this is their book. We always ask at the end, do you have one book that you would recommend to our listeners? And this one has been recommended several times now. And so I just decided to jump in and start reading it for myself. I think it will also be very interesting and a lot of fun to discuss. So join me next week as we jump into that. And let me know any comments, feedback, questions, experiences you want to share. I'd love to hear from you on our Tough Decisions Facebook page. You can drop a comment or drop a message to us there.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.